in your book, you highlight two aspects of critical thinking: the argumentative and the communicative. You talk about intellectual virtues and then just how to engage with people. So, in light of this, I have two related questions. First, when someone encounters a claim or an argument, how should they interact with those ideas and exemplify intellectual virtues? And second, when someone is having a conversation or a debate, how should they interact with their interlocutor and exemplify just personal conversational virtues?
Good questions. So I was actually reaching for my book because I give like tangible tips and so on, and like I can kind of just verbally summarize and elaborate a little bit upon some of them. We're not going to go through all of them, of course, but I really think that'll be helpful for the audience. So, um, in terms of like the intellectual virtues, I mean, virtues are something like you know stable traits of character that help orient you towards truth in the case of intellectual virtues, and like goodness in the case of moral virtues. Um, So some intellectual virtues that I focus on in the book are like one is intellectual humility, right? And that involves like basically recognizing the limits of your knowledge and the limits of your reasoning and your abilities, and kind of orienting your focus on truth rather than like status and just being like, you know, popular in the public eye and so on. But instead, at least in terms of your intellectual pursuits, you're kind of valuing the truth of the matter rather than just, putting on a show as the sophists did to try to either sound clever or try to gain a following. Instead, it's kind of valuing truth. So it's recognizing your limitations and orienting your focus on truth. And it's just a willingness to say things like "I don't know" when you genuinely don't know, or like "I haven't researched this sufficiently" when you haven't researched it sufficiently, and so on. All too often, we try to opine on things that we haven't sufficiently studied. So yeah, intellectual humility is really just all about a recognition of the limits of your abilities and your knowledge, being willing to say I don't know when you genuinely don't know, and focusing yourself, orienting yourself on truth rather than like status or being seen as clever and so on. There's also intellectual curiosity, right, which is just this like flaming passion for inquiry and answering questions and kind of just getting to the truth about it, getting to the bottom of things. Just not being content with intellectual laziness. There's also intellectual perseverance, which is kind of like intellectual perseverance is helps you kind of keep going. So intellectual curiosity is kind of like the spark, you got the curiosity there, you got the interest there, and perseverance is kind of what drives you through in order to try to find the answers to your questions and so on. So again, it's a committed rejection of just being lazy with regard to your intellectual life. So like actually reading these sorts of things, actually reflecting on them. No one's saying you have to do this all the time, but like the intellectually curious and intellectually perseverant individual doesn't neglect this aspect of their lives. They're kind of intellectual or epistemic flourishing, right? Trying to get to the bottom of questions that interest them and that are really deeply meaningful and valuable and significant. There's
Yeah, can
open-mindedness,
I add
right?
something
So
here?
yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I've like you're talking about intellectual perseverance and just kind of perpetually learning about things and deepening your understanding, coming closer to truth. I've wondered when do you just come to a conclusion and not necessarily stop, because coming to a conclusion, there's always tentativeness, and you don't. It's not like you just put that in the past. And one thing in the introduction to Gandhi's autobiography, he's talking about all these experiments of truth that he's conducted throughout his life, and he has this thing, and I don't want to botch it, but I'll have to paraphrase it. He says, "I'm open to changing my mind on these things, but I've come to these as conclusions, and so I'll live my life according to them, as if they were true, unless and until I change my mind." And I think that's valuable. I'm not
Hmm.
sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's entirely reasonable. Like, so long as like you formed the conclusions in a justifiable manner to begin with, um, like you didn't just do them through wishful thinking and through just like ignoring countervailing considerations and only reading your own side and so on, right? So long as you come to your conclusions on the basis of like at least reasonable, sufficient justification, then I think that's a totally reasonable approach. Now, you did ask like when can we get to that kind of point where you feel sufficiently settled to act as if it's true, and you um, kind of commit to it in some sense, and you're still open to revision, of course, in the face of countervailing considerations. But there comes a point at which you could truthfully say you've committed to this and you do indeed believe it. That is a very difficult question, and I really think it's just going to be a case by case basis. Like in some cases,
Yeah.
there are going to be certain pragmatic factors that make that very difficult. Like if you have an extreme peanut allergy, um, it's not going to be enough if the waiter just said, "Oh yeah, like there aren't any peanuts in this." Um, like you also you probably want like a second opinion. You probably want to know how careful this restaurant is, how much they take allergies seriously. You probably want to know if there are if like peanuts were also prepared alongside your food and so on. Like in another case, if you don't have a peanut allergy and you just don't want to have peanuts, that might be enough evidence and justification for you to kind of conclude your inquiry. But um, in this case, if you have a severe peanut allergy, it may not be. So like it may depend on various pragmatic factors, various contextual factors. It just depends, really. Um, and there's no one size fits all answer to this. I mean, it sort of just depends on the question. Try to get some semblance of reasons and justification that seem to you sufficiently plausible to justify believing the thing, and try not to ignore the other side, as it were, the people who disagree with you, and at least look into them to some extent and try to see if there are counters to the arguments that you've been persuaded by. And at some point, I don't have a recipe, but at some point it just
No, yeah.
um, yeah, it just falls out that you commit. So yeah, I mean that's a great question, but unfortunately I don't have a one size fits all answer.
No, yeah.
So
We're
yeah,
talking about intellectual virtues, and you just mentioned looking for counter arguments. That is maybe not necessarily an intellectual virtue, but something that intellectually virtuous people do. They don't just read one side. They don't just engage in confirmation bias throughout their
yeah, yeah.
searches. They're
Yeah, or at
looking
least they
for
try to,
other
right?
sides.
That's the thing. They try to.
Right, right, right.
Because we're humans, right? Unfortunately, we all succumb to these biases. I do. You do. We all do. Sorry to speak on your behalf, but the
No, yeah,
scientific
sure.
evidence is in. The scientific evidence is in, and unfortunately, a lot of stuff is ingrained in us. So we all have these biases, right? The task of the intellectually virtuous person is to at least try to mitigate them, right? I'm not trying to sit here and I know you didn't say this or didn't even intimate it, but for the audience, I'm not trying to sit here and pontificate from my oh holy virtuous position. No, I'm not. I'm just trying to help all of us in this collective pursuit of truth and this collective process of growing and flourishing intellectually, which is a work in progress for all of us, myself included. And so I'm really just trying to help all of us, at least try to mitigate the influence of these biases and factors and so on. And how do you do that? It's through trying to cultivate and trying to develop these virtues. So yeah, we've covered some of these intellectual virtues, but what matters also for our inquiry is that our inquiry is very often interpersonal, right? Like we're often reading papers and discussing them with people. We engage in discussions with people online, in real life. We debate with people. We email with people and so on. So like the intellectual life is a conversational life, right? So like these virtues or these kind of tips for how to be intellectually virtuous and how to converse in a kind of productive, love-oriented, truth-oriented, virtuous manner, these are intimately bound up with one another. So getting onto the conversational virtues, I give like 22 tips in the book um, for like productive conversations, and I'll just go through some of them here. So like the first tip is to just kind of like recognize that we do indeed have these biases. Like the first step in trying to mitigate them is to recognize that we have these biases in favor of our current views, in favor of people within our tribe, as it were, those who agree with us, and so on, and just trying to be open-minded and recognize that we really could be wrong. Um, and that we really don't know everything, and that our abilities really are quite limited, and there may very well be reasons bearing on the conclusions that we accept. There may very well be reasons that bear on those, either for or against, of which we are unaware, right? And that can help appropriately kind of temper our confidence in our conclusions. Um, and so that we can kind of avoid being dogmatic and overconfident, and we can be sufficiently open-minded. So that's the first step: to kind of recognize the biases and affirm to ourselves our limits, and that there may very well be things of which we're unaware and that we haven't considered. Another tip is to kind of when you're conversing with someone, don't only focus on the things about which you disagree. You can try to seek common
Hmm.
ground, and that can it kind of breaks the animosity between you guys. Like, we're fellow explorers on a team together, and we actually do indeed have a lot of this common ground here. So, like, let's not overlook it, right? So, you can emphasize agreement. Too often we get bogged down in our
That's
disagreements.
that's something I noticed from some of my favorite philosophers when they have a debate. It's YouTube, so you want to call things debates, but A lot of times, if they're mature philosophers, they spend half an hour to an hour just agreeing on things. I saw, I think, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen and Philip Goff on a debate about agentive cosmopsychism, and a lot of it was just them agreeing on things and appreciating each other's genuine pursuit of truth. And
Hmm.
that's, for some people, that might not be as fun because disagreement is provocative. You can instigate, but it's also better. Like you can build better connections when you focus on your commonalities.
Exactly. I mean, it shows that they're on the same team, right? They're on the same path toward a common destination. They're explorers on a journey toward truth, and they're not kind of like opposing tribes who are trying to, one up each other and who are trying to just put each other down and so on. Like that's not a recipe for fruitful, productive, love-oriented, truth-oriented exchanges of ideas. So yeah, that's another tip here, just to recognize that kind of we're on the same team and to ditch these, like, language really affects how we think, right? And so, like, if we really try to stay away from using language like eviscerated them or like utterly demolished your argument or utterly disproved what you believe or like I've totally demonstrated and proved my view, um, or like I've totally discombobulated the other side. Like just these very tribalistic, very kind of triggering, colorful words. They affect how we think. They affect how we see the other side. We can start to see the other side as irrational if we think that we've decisively, demonstrably proved, with self-evidently our side, and so on. And that can really help. I mean, that kind of facilitates dehumanizing the other side. Like they're not rational. They can't see our self-evident conclusions and so on. So like it's a recipe for dehumanization. That in turn makes it kind of cements you in your current beliefs, and if you have falsehoods and they have truths, you're going to be unable to get the truths from them because
Right.
you already think you've kind of downplayed their perspective, their testimony, and you've kind of cemented yourself in your current falsehoods and you very likely do indeed believe current things that are currently false. So yeah,
So,
just
what are
recognizing that we're on the same team.
some alternative phrases other than like, well, you're wrong because like things like that? What are some ways that we can communicate in more compassionate, charitable ways?
Yeah, so one of them is like, uh I'll just give a few examples. So here's one difficulty that might afflict your view,
That's
and I'm
good.
wondering what you think about it. Yeah, it's like, here's one difficulty that might afflict your view. I'm wondering what you think about that. So that's one. Or like, I don't know. Here's one of the worries that I have for your view. It seems like it might imply P, but in my view, I think there are really good reasons to think not P. So like, do you agree with me that your view implies P, and do you think that there are good reasons to reject P? Um, so like putting them as questions and things like that. And even if you're not putting them as questions, feel like you can say, here's an objection to your argument, not here's a decisive debunking refutation of your silly argument or whatever, but like, um, here's an objection to premise four. In my view, premise four is false because such and such. I think that's fine. It's totally fine to say that. You're not saying like, premise four is obviously false, and we can totally debunk it, refute it through my decisive demonstration proof here, which I can give, and etc. So just communicate to others how you would kind of want them to communicate to your own arguments and so on. Now, of course, some people like that kind of one-upmanship and I guess debate bro kind of thing. But at least if you're interested in truth, you're not going to be very interested in that sort of thing, I don't think.